the reason I chose this topic is because it's sort of focused on pharmacology rather than just plain medicine, because I think it's an area that is ripe for disruption. And excuse me if I'm populating this talk with lots of buzzwords, it's just going to happen, but I think it is ripe for it. So this is a bit of a speculation, it's a bit of a critical perspective, and I hope you'll go on this journey with me. So firstly, let's look at how drugs make it to the market today. So firstly, a drug starts as an idea that a scientist will test first in a lab, then maybe do some simulations possibly, also test in a lab in vivo on animals. And once there's a fairly good understanding of the mechanisms there, it gets submitted for clinical trials. Now, clinical trials is where a drug is first tested on humans. Usually go in 3 phases. Phase 1 is a few dozen people, just to establish the effects of a drug. Phase 2 will be a few dozen people, maybe a couple of hundred, to come up with, say, dosage recommendations and things like that. And then a phase 3 trial will have a few thousand people in it, and it's just to confirm the benefits of a drug and also its safety. And then, once that has happened, the drug can possibly be approved, and if it is, if all goes well, that's when it hits the market. This whole process can take about 10 to 12 years. From idea to market, it's a very, very long process. And once it's on the market, there's also some post-marketing studies that are done to look at long-term effects of the drugs and possibly also pick up other maybe side effects, adverse effects that may arise. But once the drug is on the market, it's out there, right? So how much does this all cost? Right, so what do you have to pay for? Firstly, you have to pay for highly qualified staff for, well, over a decade, right? Secondly, you have to pay for materials, you have to buy lab equipment, everything has to stay modern, and so on. That's just the first phase. Now, you add to that the cost of clinical trials. For example, volunteers who take part in clinical trials are often compensated for their participation. And also a huge and costly administrative overhead that is related to the strict regulations of the pharmaceutical markets. And then, well, this cost is very difficult to evaluate when you first start trying to develop a drug, right? But in retrospect, it's possible. So there was an interesting study done by Forbes in 2013 that came to the conclusion that from idea to market, it can cost a company of the order of $350 million US. So that's quite a vast investment. But that's not all. On top of that, this is for the drug that makes it to the market. In fact, around 10% or even less of drugs that reach phase 1 of clinical trials actually get approved in the end. So there's all that initial investment for all these failed drugs as well that you have to pay for. And if you take that into account, hold on to your seat, you can be looking at up to $5 billion. So it's extremely, extremely expensive to develop. So once a drug is on the market, obviously you have patents. So there's a whole lot of issues whether you can patent a molecule or not because it's something that occurs in nature. There's a lot of different debates going around that. But a patent can cover the composition of a drug, but also processes related to its manufacture. And it will give the company about 20 or 25 years, depending where, to protect this intellectual property and to recoup the cost of developing the drug. So making money and recouping a few $1 billion over 20 to 25 years, it's not that long, actually. And once the patent expires, other companies can come and make generics. Now, in some countries, like India and China, for example, governments have jumped in to shorten the time of the patent protection in an effort to make generics accessible faster and to keep the costs of healthcare down. So one of the things is, if only 10% of your drugs actually that you try to develop make it to the market, maybe you want to try to improve this rate. And there's some interesting thinking around that. Firstly, that you can, instead of trying to replace what the body does, you try to strengthen what the body does. So you build upon the body's, upon genetics, for example, or you strengthen the immune system instead of replacing it. And that yields some results. What's also interesting now is that tissue engineering provides you with live surrogate samples on which you can test something before you actually go and test it on humans. And that's also a very interesting avenue. But, so now let's take a look at how clinical trials work. You have a group of people, and of these people, they're randomly assigned to either a group that receives some kind of clinical intervention or a group of people who don't receive it. And it's a quantitative study that aims at comparing the results of the different groups in order to infer a statistical significance that may indicate that the drug works, or not, as the case may be. So if you don't receive anything, you receive like the sugar pill, the placebo, right? And so you compare no treatment versus treatment. You know, in principle, that's a good idea. But there are some shortcomings to this method. So there we go. Firstly, it's been shown that there is a mind over matter effect. So the placebo effect, which is that somebody gets better even though they didn't get any drugs, happens to evolve. It's not a static thing. It's not always the same thing. You can't just count that whatever the treatment, you'll have so many % of people who will just happen to feel better. No. It's been shown that, for example, advertising has an effect. There's 2 countries in the world where direct advertising of drugs to people, to patients, to consumers, not to the medical professions, but to the people like you and me, has led to generally a more trusting attitude towards drugs and therefore higher rates of placebo effect. Placebo is stronger in those 2 countries. Also, it has been shown that if you have a good relationship with the carer, the patient-carer relationship, the nature of that relationship, if it's a relationship of trust or if it isn't, has an effect on the placebo effect. So it's not completely static at all. Another thing is, well, if we misuse drugs, and we face a continuous threat of entering a post-antibiotic age, and this is a very, very, very scary thing, especially for a mum. And it's really, really scary. So how are we? What are the paths to a post-antibiotic age? So basically, what evolves, enables bacteria to evolve resistance to antibiotics, what makes them evolve and become unaffected by antibiotics, is non-lethal exposure, in the sense that they're exposed to antibiotics, but doesn't kill them. So then they can develop resistance. In agriculture, that's been used extensively. You use antibiotics in your agri-alimentary complexes to reduce the number of cattle that get sick and that you can't make money on. And so you just give antibiotics to everybody. And those antibiotics end up in water, they end up in the food, and so on. And that's one of the places where, you know, bacteria get low exposure and they can develop out in the wild resistance to antibiotics. But also, misuse of drugs. If you don't finish your course of antibiotics and you haven't actually killed the disease in you, you give it a chance to recover from it and develop differently and evolve. If we use too much antibiotics when it's not needed, if you take antibiotics but you have a viral infection, those antibiotics will just go out in the wild and give bacteria a chance to become resistant. So this is a very scary threat, and that's why we probably need to improve the way we use antibiotics, but we don't yet have the means to deliver antibiotics in the right place in the body where it's needed and in the exact right amount for it to just act and heal us from there. And so a lot of it gets flushed out of the body. So another thing is, well, mathematics. Because if we look at the effectiveness of a drug, the effectiveness of a drug depends on a number of factors. Of course, the dose, the age of a patient, the gender, the weight, the ethnicity, etc. It's a lot, like metabolic rates and other medical conditions. You name it. It depends on an incredible large number of factors. But in clinical trials, with small numbers of people, we have a limited number of data points. So we can't restrict the value, or we can't take into account more parameters than we have data points, for example. It makes no mathematical sense. So what we do is we ignore these other parameters. Ignoring those parameters doesn't mean that the sensitivity to those parameters isn't worth looking at. It just means that we ignore the sensitivity to those parameters. So take gender, for example. So it's interesting to see that a number of drugs have had their dosage recommendations amended after people realized that the way they acted on women was very different from the way they acted on men. The reason I'm saying this is that, well, that's like half the population, right? And so it does matter. It really does matter. One of the reasons why this is the case is that, well, why would you ignore certain parameters in your analysis? Well, for example, by tradition, right? Women have been traditionally kept out of clinical trials because it was thought that women having hormonal cycles makes them less reliable in terms of, you know, what you try to assert with your clinical trial. So underrepresentation of women in clinical trials. Another reason is cost. Imagine if you have a clinical trial of a few hundred people and you need to analyze their gut microbiome every 2 weeks for like 3 months or something. Imagine the cost. So the cost of that would make the whole trial completely prohibitive. So there's different factors that make these parameters being ignored, but we don't necessarily know which ones matter the most or which ones don't matter. And this is one of the key points, I think, that we can come back to when we really talk about big data. It's this. So the possibilities of big data. What does big data do? So I love big data. Big data turns a snapshot with a single perspective, one view, one-dimensional nearly, and static, and you trust that for something that's continuously changing, right? So what big data does is that it gives us something that's dynamic, something that is multi-parameter or multi-dimensional, something that you can analyze continuously, you can explore it, you can look at things that you didn't look at before, you can... big data is really... I'll give you 2 examples. Big data is the difference between crash testing and self-driving cars. A crash test is when you take a car and you break it. You break a few, and then you look at what's happened to them and you say, yeah, this is safe for the road, right? A self-driving car, the approach to evaluating the safety in a self-driving car is constant re-evaluation of the environment, looking around, etc. It doesn't depend on the car or how it's built. It also depends on the person who's about to cross in front of you, on the truck that's speeding behind you, and so on. So it's a perspective that's much richer, and it's continuously re-evaluating. I think this is a very powerful way of explaining why big data is such a good tool. Big data is also, for example, the difference between a once-off environmental assessment before construction project and smart cities, constantly connected, constantly looking at their environment, air quality, traffic flows, etc., etc. So big data really goes from the snapshot to the continuous intelligence and evaluation and monitoring of things. So what can it do in terms of, well, medicine and pharmacology in particular? So in my opinion, we don't need to develop a lot of new technologies. That's not where the challenge lies. We have all the technology we need already to make huge progress, whether it's, you know, a portable a blood pressure measurement, or your cell phone, or your tracker, your step counter and things. All those things, we have that already. Now, big data in medicine has led a lot of people to think of personalized medicine, where you keep tracking one person so much that you can constantly readjust treatment and things like that. But I'm more interested in, see, this to me sounds like something like a prize that becomes available to the wealthy at 1% of the world. What I'm interested in is more, oh, well, let's just look at this. We'll get there. Imagine, talking about this technology, that every person with all their data, their location, gender, ethnicity, temperature, what they eat and drink, their weight, their step counters, their genetics, their blood groups, their accidents, their dental history, everything. You put it into a big ocean of data, and then imagine that everybody else does that as well, right? We're not there, it doesn't exist, but let's just, for the sake of argument, imagine that we have that, right? Everything is there. We can just go and play with the data. What can we do with it? Okay, what can we do with it for the many? Click. There we go, right. Let's look at South Africa, for example. It's an amazing country with a vast population of an incredible diversity. You have a vast population that's studied, underserved. That is, you have ethnic silos. You have people who straddle ethnicities that are ungroupable. It's a really fascinating population. But how can we make big data and this hypothetical ocean of data serve everybody? So what we can do is go back to this mathematics problem, right? Take into account every single factor. If there's enough data, then we can take into account everything. We can take into account the level of activity of people. We can take into account their compounding medical conditions. We can take into account, because in that ocean of data, we'll find somebody who has a similar profile. We can take into account their socioeconomic background, their access to medical care, if they live far away. We can take all those things into account if that data is there, right? Because we can look at similar people. And the great thing with artificial intelligence is that it can intelligently interpolate when data is missing. So I was going to draw you like a cube of data with a hole in the middle and nice lines to interpolate and things, and it was a little bit abstract. So let me instead try to give an example. So there's this patient, right? This patient needs a certain care. But of this patient, you have their symptoms, you have their age, their location, their cultural and socioeconomic background, and so on. But you don't have their weight, because this person is somewhere where the weight didn't get measured. If you know a lot of contextual things about this person, you can interpolate from that information a likely weight range, for example, for that patient, right? And regardless of what stereotypes just popped into your mind, trust that artificial intelligence will be cleverer than that. It's not stereotyping, it really is intelligence. And so then what you can do with that patient is come up with a near optimal recommended course of treatment, right? Near optimal, because there's some interpolation there. That's very interesting. But what you can also do is you can also highlight particular risk factors based on the profile of that person, based on that person's genetic makeup and circumstances and so on. So for example, if that person is in a group that happens to present maybe a heightened sensitivity to a drug, maybe you want to watch out for a specific side effect, or you want to watch out for maybe blood pressure, because if blood pressure goes up, then you might want to reevaluate the course of treatment and so on. So you can flag those things. So this is now personalized medicine without the personal medical crew, thanks to big data. So it's a very exciting opportunity, in my opinion. Now, also, which I think is very interesting, is that if you go from clinical trials to big data, where you have all those additional parameters that you have recorded from the metabolic rates, microbiome, the genetics, the epigenetics, the absorption rates, distribution rates of chemicals in the body, the excretion rates, the plasma volume, over time, et cetera, then, well, great. You can do a good job of optimizing your courses of treatment. But what you can also do, and this is where I think it's even more interesting, is that you can take all those variables out, and you can change perspective. Instead of considering that your drug is just your drug and it'll work the same way wherever, and if you have more body fat, it'll do more and of this, and if you eat more, then it'll be a little bit more of that. Instead of considering the drug as a constant, you can based on the outcomes, consider the drug as a variable. And you can consider the combination of the drug and the conditions as variables. And that opens a whole new dimension of analysis, which I think is extremely interesting. Now, let me see. So the reason this is very interesting is that it opens the door to a new kind of research, right? Because instead of just putting a drug out there, we can constantly monitor it and see how well it does, and what kind of people it is good for, and what kind of people it kind of doesn't really help, and so on. And so that is really, really, really important. But our systems are not very well adapted for this. So if we look at our systems, click. Right, we're not ready. A scientific publication, which is how new scientific knowledge gets out into the world, is by design a static snapshot. You've done an experiment, these are your results, you write them up, you publish them. That's not compatible with this continuous dynamic monitoring. If you look at the processes of government agencies to get drugs onto the market, you have this process you have to follow, then when it's out, you do some post-marketing studies, but it's not followed, right? If it ends up having, like, suddenly people pick up something, then you step back and you take it off the market, but that's about as good as it gets. Other things, well, the way we teach and learn medicine, the way doctors are trained is also not compatible with that. It's not compatible with a data-driven deployment of constantly renewed clinical best practice. It is not. It's static. You learn, you graduate, you practice. A lot of people keep getting better and so on, but it's not by design open to this. And even, I'm showing here some advertising. There's advertising to medical professionals. There's also, in some countries, advertising to consumers. I would like to make a parallel here between advertising of drugs and old wives' tales, because it creates a culture of belief around the effects of things. And that is, cultures get ingrained, it becomes habits. And it's also something that is not easy to make evolve. And so those are some reasons why I think we're not ready for this data ocean of everything. Now, the challenges to reach that are going to be many and complex. So, for example, there's going to be legal challenges, there's going to be ethics challenges, there's going to be culture, there's going to be the fact that it's market-driven. Those present a lot of challenges. I'll give you an example. If you have this ocean of data, and there's one drug that seems to be less and less effective for most people, but just work just for a smaller and smaller group of people, then a company might decide not to make a generic when the patent of that drug expires, because it will be seen as not worth it. And then the patients who really need that drug are left with no choice but the premium price drug that the first manufacturer came up with. So that's not ideal. But before we get to that, though, the real challenge is obviously a data challenge. There's lots of challenges in that. And so the data challenges I'm thinking of, well, firstly, scientists themselves are biased towards positive results. There's something called the Cochrane study, so meta-analysis. It's an organization that takes, say, all the scientific publications about, say, for example, one drug, right? And they combine them, and they do robust statistical analyses of the combined data. And if you do that, the bias towards positive results by scientists actually comes up. It is a real thing. Another thing is that in research, the reward system is kind of designed to favor the winners, right? So there's been cases of data manipulation or things like that. And a few years ago, maybe a decade ago or so, there was a massive lawsuit in Italy. There was like 12,000 doctors that were taken to court because they had been prescribing a drug with certain preference because the company that made that drug had paid them holidays to fancy places and given them laptops and things. And so So the whole reward system is not conducive to well, it's a data challenge. It's a human challenge and it's a data challenge. No. So other challenges is accessibility, obviously. Availability. The data needs to be available. We don't record everything we do, right? And so even though we record more and more and more, and the quantified self and all that, it's fun, and so we're not quite there yet, right? So the data must be available. And that raises challenges of data governance, because that data belongs to you. It's who you are, it's your identity. Releasing it makes you vulnerable. Accessibility is also a problem. If you have a piece of paper with a plot printed out, that's not data. For you to be able to use that, you have to go and take a ruler and work out what the numbers are. Or if it's a printed table, you can't feed paper to your spreadsheet software, right? So between the digital and the non-digital and so on, so different formats and different interfaces exist. So accessibility of data is a challenge. But I think another one that we haven't even started to explore is the compatibility of data. And I'll give you the following example. Imagine that there's a country where you have anonymized health records that are made available for medical research. Yay, fantastic, great. At the same time, you have a wearable tech firm that also releases its user data. Fantastic, now you can combine the two, except for those data sets to be compatible, for the person who wears their step counter and their medical records to be linked, you need to have some kind of identification. But there exists no form of identification, of digital identification today that doesn't present a risk for privacy. And so that is a really, really big challenge in itself. Other challenges then are, well, risk and reputation and liability and that sort of stuff. What pharmaceutical company will be willing to share their data when there's like loss of life? If a mistake has been made or something just doesn't work because it doesn't work, who would dare do that? Even, I mean, in incurring the risk of somebody coming seeking damages. It's going to be very difficult to convince the industry to contribute data like that. I mean, look at what happened to the tobacco industry and all those lies and things. Anyway, so those are big, big challenges. And so I may have been very critical about the way we do things today, but I must point out that it's the best we have, and it's working quite well, actually. Where there's access to healthcare, we've never been better, and there's some really, really, really smart people out there who make sure that we live better, longer, etc. So it's really quite amazing. But for us to enter into this speculative age, and I must say, this is all speculation. This data ocean would be great to have, but it's going to be hard to get there. But if we look at how many of us there are around the world, I mean, 7-8 billion people, that's kind of big data. And if we look at how many people around the world are actually suffering, I think it is worth at least looking into doing research at the same level on, say, drug development and administration and effectiveness and so on, as we do with, say, bioinformatics in understanding the way the body works. Because the body is not isolated. It works in conjunction with drugs and things like that. So despite the challenges, despite the market-driven aspect of this pharmaceutical industry, despite the incredible different regulations and things like that that are in place, I think there's definitely room for some thinking around that. And after all this indigestible stuff, I thought I'd give you a little bit of eye candy to illustrate the data journey we're on. Okay, so step one, just a little bit of data. White, black, white, okay? It's binary, 3 data points, nice. But this now then becomes an image. Now we have a better understanding of what's happening. But in reality, and in 30 seconds time, well, does this white, black, white image still fit the picture? And this is the beauty of big data. And before saying thank you, I just want to give credit. This is an incredible zoom and fly through a 3D fractal that was created by a guy called Jérémy Brunet, who created this for a TED Talk, and it's supposed to illustrate the beauty and the complexity of the human body, and I think it does it quite well, even though it's not a real human body. So thank you very much.